Good morning. My name is Jill Higginson, and I'm a professor at the University of Delaware in mechanical engineering and biomedical engineering. Today, I'm here in my role as director of the pilot projects mechanism for the Delaware ACCEL program. And my goal today is to describe the pilot projects review process. So we'll describe in general the review process and the scoring criteria that our reviewers will use. In advance. So I wanted to start with an overview of this process and a timeline. You'll probably know that our pilot projects are due March 16th, and we anticipate that funding will start July 1st. And so there's a lot of things that need to happen in those quick months. For each application, we'll need to identify the appropriate reviewers, and then we'll send out the reviews to be conducted by peers and then by two of our cores. Applications at that point will be pooled and ranked in mid-April, ideally. These scores aren't merged, but they are all going to be considered. And then the executive committee for the CTR will select which ones to forward for approval. And I'll describe each of these steps in more detail in just a minute. So first, we need to identify the appropriate reviewers for each of your applications. Let's see, there are a large list of prior ACCEL award recipients that we lean on for a lot of these reviews. And if you haven't had a chance to review a proposal in the past, I would recommend that you do that. It gives you a lot of insight on how best to prepare your proposal for others to review. But we also have a list of mentors and senior investigators who are available to help with our review process. In addition, we have access to the CTR National Reviewer Bank. So if we can't find somebody to match up with your specific application, we can reach out to experts from around the country who may be able to provide more constructive feedback. For each application, we anticipate finding at least 2 reviewers. We specifically designate these so that they're not from your institution. I try to make them in general knowledge about your content area, but this might be a broad description, just like you would see for an NIH study section. So we might see somebody from, who has expertise in cardiovascular or cancer or neuromuscular topics and try to apply that to your area of expertise. In addition, it's really important that because we have such a quick turnaround that we find somebody who's willing and able to do this review and will commit to do this by the due date because it's important that we stay on time. We try to be mindful of the reviewer's burden, and we only send up to about 5 applications per reviewer. I'll actually try to send less if I can get a bunch of reviewers on deck. And so they'll have each of these proposals for about a month in order to provide their review and provide feedback on the submission. So each reviewer, as they're reviewing each application, has access to a web form that they'll complete. And they'll use the NIH scoring criteria or the rating scale from 1 to 9 that's shown on the right here. So 1 is going to be those high impact projects that are feasible and have lots of impact. A medium score in the 4 to 6 range is going to be something that has a weakness, but this could potentially be addressed. And then the lower scores are those that might have low impact or there's flaws in the design of the project. The reviewer will be given all of this information shown on the screen here and asked to provide feedback specifically on the 5 typical NIH areas of significance, investigators, innovation, approach, and environment. And they'll review them based on the criterion described here. So for significance, does the project address a significant problem specific to the clinical and translational research area that we support with the CTR mechanism? Are the investigators qualified to perform this work, and has a mentor been identified who can provide the appropriate level of support? Is the project innovative and novel, and does this advance the field? Are the methods sound and feasible? And does the environment provide the resources that are needed in order to conduct the proposed work? And also, do we use the established cores that are provided by the CTR program? So for each of these 5 areas, the reviewer will be asked to fill in a text box related to the strengths and weaknesses that they identify. So it's important that if they identify a lower score, that they also list some kind of weaknesses so that this provides useful feedback for the applicant to actually go back and address their deficits so that they can prepare a better submission next time around. In addition to these 5 core areas, the reviewer will also provide a score about the overall impact, so the likelihood of this project to exert a sustained and powerful influence, the chance that this will ultimately be developed into a successful NIH proposal, because ultimately that's the goal. This is supposed to be a stepping stone to get you to bigger and more robust funding. In addition, specific to the CTR mechanism, our reviewers are asked to determine whether or not your project addresses the ACCEL mission. So does the scope of the work and the investigator's status correspond to the priorities of the ACCEL program? And these are a number of areas that have been listed on the RFA for each application. So ultimately, what the applicant should do is make it easy for the reviewer to identify these sections and review these sections. So oftentimes what I'll do is indicate, in bold, the significance of this project is, and I'll list those items in a very specific way so it's easy for the reviewers to identify that. Then, in addition to those NIH review scoring criteria, members of the BIRD Core, or the Biostatistics, Epidemiology, and Research Design Core, which is directed by Dr. Derkowitz, they will evaluate the statistical design. So specifically, they'll look at some of the questions that are identified here. For example, is the study design and the proposed analyses appropriate? Has the sample size been justified? Do you have personnel available to actually perform this analysis? Has the source of data been identified? Is there a data management plan? And are patients randomized, and is the scheme described? So these are just some sample questions that need to be considered by the statistical team. They also convert an NIH scoring system where 1 is exceptional and 9 would be a weak application, but they convert this into 3 categories where the statistical design is either appropriate, acceptable, or not acceptable. And they also will identify strengths and weaknesses so that we can address any concerns in future applications. So it's important that you consider your statistical design when you're writing these applications, but it's also, I want to make it obvious to you that you're invited and even encouraged to seek consultation on your plan before you even submit, and you can contact Dr. Derkowitz or the BIRD Core through the consulting page on the CTR webpage. At the same time as the BIRD reviews, members of the CEO team, the Community Engagement and Outreach team, which is directed by Dr. Bittner-Fagan, they also will assess the degree of community engagement of your project. And so there's a form that is recommended that you complete the form that's linked here, and I'm going to show you this. It's a really simple form where you include the details about your proposal, but then down below, you indicate whether or not you've consulted with the outreach, the CEO core, and specifically you identify whether you're addressing one of the CEO priorities. And these include mental and behavioral health, social determinants of health, opiate and other drug abuse, misuse issues, health equity and disparities, or other topics that have been identified as priorities. The rest of this submission form is relatively straightforward, but it asks a number of questions about, how will your patient and community needs be determined, how community members or patients are or will be engaged in the research, and whether you would consider this a community engaged pilot application. So let me see if I can jump back to my other screen. Okay, oops. So with your application, you should submit a form like that indicates your contribution to the community engagement priorities. This form, then the reviewers will also assess your application, and they'll use a very similar reviewer's form. And I'll show you this too. The idea here is that the review team, which will include 1 member of the community engagement team and 1 member from the community advisory council to evaluate each application, This team will assess whether or not this fits into the community research priorities of the ACCEL program, whether there is evidence that the topic of the study is informed by community needs. There is evidence that the project team would work with the community to learn about and share about the issues in the research proposal. And then there is evidence that the research design includes a mechanism for ongoing community input. So each proposal will be evaluated on those metrics.
Hey, Jill.
Yeah.
Never mind, it just popped up.
Oh,
Thanks. Your slides weren't showing up, but they just started. Sorry about that.
Okay. Could you see the web page when I was showing that?
We could not see the web pages, but I can share the links with folks if anyone's interested afterwards.
I'm sorry, I was just scrolling through the forms. So anyway, you can see the link to the forms directly. So each pilot will get a community engagement score, regardless of whether you indicate that this is a community engaged project. There's no penalty if it's not a community engaged project, but this helps us identify whether each proposal is addressing some of the priorities, and this is just one of the priorities that we consider across the CTR mechanism. So while a good engagement score is helpful, good science is a requirement. And as with all of these other areas, consultation is available if you would like to more input about how to make your project more community engaged. So returning back to our timeline, you can see in March we will identify the reviewers. We'll send each application out for parallel review by your peers for the scientific content, by BIRD for the statistical design, and by CEO for the community engagement component. Then all of these scores are assembled and ultimately ranked based on those three scoring criterion. Now, we don't combine those into one unified score because it's important to distribute across. Clearly we want the projects with strong impact, with high impact, but we also want to make sure that the statistical design is adequate, and we want to include community engaged projects as we distribute across our priorities. In addition, we'll distribute the pilot awards across the institutions, paying attention to our priority areas, and ultimately what the executive committee of the CTR will do is recommend a subset of the applications for funding. So then these applications are submitted to the EAC, the External Advisory Committee of the CTR. So this is an external board of investigators from around the country who provide feedback on the function of our CTR, and they will vote whether to approve or reject our recommendations. And that process happens pretty quick, usually in a couple of days. And then we will send all of these applications to the NIH for approval. Now, it's critical that we already have IRB and IACUC approvals done by that point, because the NIH will need that to be completed before the funding, which will start on July 1st. The NIH approvals have traditionally been taking us about 6 weeks, so hopefully we can send those in, by mid to late May, which is why this whole process needs to be somewhat expedited and streamlined. Last year, we saw 42 pilot submissions and ultimately funded 10 of those. And you can see the distribution across MUSC, Christiana Care, Nemours, University of Delaware, and Dell State, which was a new addition to our program in the last couple of years. The funding rate was about 24%. We did get funding in time to start on July 1st. And you can also see some of the other funding mechanisms. The shovel-readies and the retreats are listed here too. Last year, we also took the opportunity to evaluate and pilot some of these other scoring protocols. So the shovel-ready proposals included the BIRD reviews, and then in the fall, the CEO review process has been piloted, so that this year, when the RFAs were released in January, we are ready to roll with all of the different scoring processes for all of the pilot applications. Okay, I think that's the scope of what I wanted to cover. My name and contact information is listed here. Please feel free to reach out to me if I'm not able to answer any questions you have today. And one little side note, I wanted to mention is that we've also just released additional travel awards to be supported by the CTR. So you are also eligible for funding to continue to do a short-term sabbatical or to invite investigators to come to your institution. And so these will be posted on the website soon. I'm happy to take any questions.